Thank you for coming to tonight's program. My name is Bailey Krell, and I'm the operations assistant at the Jefferson. It's my pleasure to kick off tonight's event, and I'm going to do three things: go over some housekeeping notes, tell you about the upcoming events we have, and introduce our speaker for this evening. If you need assistance during the event, I'll be in the back, and so will Marion if you need help. The bathrooms are right out this door if you need those. And a reminder for the questions at the end, please raise your hand to be called on and project your voice since we don't have any microphones, just so everybody can hear it. Now to the upcoming events. Tomorrow at noon at the Jefferson on State Street, the JCLA 2024 cohort will be having a community conversation called Our Youth Are in Crisis, How Can You Make a Difference? And then next week on Monday at 6, Richard Arthur will deliver a lecture at our Fairview Satellite at the Lincoln Library. His lecture is called Lafayette, Founding Father and American Citizen. And then next Tuesday at 7 p.m., Kimberly Montague will be speaking about the Trinity of American Architecture, Richardson, Sullivan, and Wright at the Jefferson's main location. Lastly, I would like to introduce to you our speaker for this evening. Dr. Louie is a director of Economic Research Institute of Erie, ERIE, an associate professor of economics in the Black School of Business at Penn State Barron. He received his bachelor's in economics from Northwestern University, his master's and doctorate degrees in economics from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. His areas of specialization are macroeconomics, international economics, the economics of labor markets, and the economy of China. As director of ERIE, Erie, Dr. Louie has provided analysis and commentary on issues related to the Erie economy for local and national news media. Let's give Dr. Louie a warm welcome.
Thanks so much, Bailey.
You're welcome.
Appreciate it. Good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for taking time out of your schedule, especially since the weather is so nice, to come out and listen to me speak. It's always a pleasure for me to be a guest speaker at the Jefferson, so I thank Bailey, all of our colleagues, Ben Spiegel, who graciously invites me back, so I must be doing something right. So today I'm going to talk about economic inequality. So there are actually many facets. I'm mainly going to focus on income inequality, also partly wealth inequality, but obviously there are other components of inequality as well, which will take much more time. So I'm going to focus on the narrow issue of income inequality. So this has been an area of widespread research. It goes back a long way, but starting in the late 1990s and early 2000s, the research really exploded. And I don't think they were the first people, but they were certainly one of the pioneers, the set of pioneers who laid forth the framework that we now all look at very, very carefully. And these pioneers are two professors, Professor Thomas Piketty from the Paris School of Economics and Professor Emmanuel Saez from the University of California at Berkeley. And what they did was, in February 2003, they published a path-breaking article in a leading economics journal, which as economists we know very well, called the Quarterly Journal of Economics. They publish research work by leading scholars in the field. And what Piketty and Saez published in 2003 was an article titled Income Inequality in the United States from 1913 to 1998. As you can immediately see, this is perhaps the first systematic study that provides an overview of what's been happening to the distribution of income over a very, very long stretch of economic history in the US, going back literally to the early part of the 20th century. And so their work has been cited very frequently because of this rather comprehensive coverage of the time frame and also of their methodology. So the data that I'm going to present in the next few slides are essentially their work. It's their methodology and the results that they've compiled. In addition to the scholarly article that they published, some of you may be familiar with another publication a book by Professor Piketty that was published in 2014. So, after the article was published. And what Piketty did was really publish this massive volume that explained long-term trends in inequality. It's fairly technical, so it's kind of hard to understand unless you have some familiarity with economics, but you may be familiar with sort of one of the major quotations or takeaways that come out of this book. And the quotation is this famous formula that many people cite that says R is greater than G. So what does it mean when we say, when he said R is greater than G? Well, Professor Piketty used R to represent the rate of return on capital. That is, the rewards from people who invest in capital. So that's R. And G represents the growth rate of the overall aggregate economy. G is the growth rate. And R greater than G means that, according to Professor Piketty, through his extensive analysis of long-term historical data, he found that in the earlier part of the 20th century, and before that, there were times when the rate of growth of capital, R, was less than the growth rate of the economy. But in the 20th century, and leading up to even now, he discovered that the rate of return on capital has been greater than the growth rate of the economy. And so R is greater than G. That's rather esoteric, but the implication is easier to understand. What he argues is that whenever the rate of return to capital owners is greater than the growth rate of the economy, then you will have widening inequality. Okay? And I think that's commonsensical, that's relatively intuitive to understand, that if capital owners get consistently higher rates of return on their investments in capital, these obviously are undertaken by relatively well-to-do people who invest in capital. If that is greater than the average rate of growth in the economy, then you have this widening gap between the capital owners, the share of income going to capital owners gradually expands, and hence you have an exacerbation of inequality. Thank you. So this may be better. I apologize if you didn't hear me earlier. So R being greater than G just means we can expect to see growing inequality because the return to capital owners is greater than the average return in the economy as represented by the growth rate. Okay? So that was published in 2014 in this massive volume called Capital. So this is really where the research begins, although, as I say, there are other earlier researchers as well. But most people today, when they focus on the numbers that I'm going to talk about next, they're referring to Piketty and Saez. These are really the modern pioneers. So what did they have to say? Well, they start out by asking, what has been the share of income that goes to the top 10% of the population? So top 10% means if you look at everybody in the US and focus on those who are at the top 10%, that is, they earn more income per year than the 90% of the rest of the population. Okay, so focus on that upper echelon. How much income do they earn? What is the share of the total income that's generated by the US economy? And so if you understand that, then remember the data go all the way back to the early 20th century. What they found was that in the early years, and especially in the later part of the 19th century up to the early 1900s, what we sometimes call the Gilded Age, the share of income going to the top 10% was relatively high, over 40%. And by the early 1920s, it actually reached as high as almost 50%. So that's already rather staggering. That means half of all the income that was generated went to those who were in the upper 10% of the income distribution. And by the way, what does it mean to be in the upper top 10%? It means that as of 2022, you would be earning an annual income of $161,000. That would put you at the upper 10%. One other note to point out, which will come back later as well, and that is, what do we mean by income? Okay, when we say that this is the income share, what do we mean by income? They define income very, very narrowly, very strictly. This is pre-tax income. So this is cash income that people earn through market activities before they pay taxes. And it includes things like capital gains. So if they invest in assets, whatever capital gains they realize is included. But it does not include government transfers. So welfare payments to assist people, those are not included. It's basically what we call market income, the income people earn through market activities, whether working, investing, and so forth. So that's income, and that's what it means to be in the top 10%. The key takeaway is this, and this is what many people cite, and this is where it comes from, that after that early so-called roaring 20s period, the share of income going to this top group started to fall, and especially because of the Great Depression, the income distribution began to compress, right? The Great Depression was a very traumatic period where there was a lot of restructuring, a lot of bank failures, a lot of losses in investment portfolios. So the share of income going to this upper rich class started to fall, and it fell almost below 35%. And this is the key takeaway. Their share, the share going to the 10%, remained relatively stable throughout the 1950s. So you see this flattening out. But the other takeaway is this. Starting in the mid-70s, somewhere thereabouts, roughly 1975, what we see is a resurgence of that upward trajectory. So that after roughly 1975, the share of income from the entire economy that went to this upper 10% gradually rose back, and indeed it has continued up to this day, so that as of 2022, the latest data for which we have available, over 50% of all the income produced by the US economy goes to this top 10% of the population. That's how significant it has been, and note how that is even greater than the income share received by this group back in the early part of the 20th century. This is what most people talk about when they talk about income inequality, right? This explosive growth in the share going to the 10%. One other footnote, and that is, if you go back to what I said about the pioneering article that these two professors published, they published it in 2003. So the data in that pioneering article only goes up to the beginning of the 21st century. But Professor Saez, the gentleman on the right, he actually maintains a website at which he constantly updates the data. And that's why I'm able to extend this so you can see, even beyond 2003, what's been happening now. So if you're interested, you can go to this website and actually literally see firsthand what's happening in the more recent years. Okay, so that's top 10%. But they go further. They go one step further, actually several steps further, as you'll see. So, for instance, they then ask, let's decompose that top 10% into three even finer categories. Namely, let's look at the top 1%. So you're talking about not just the rich, but the super rich, the richest of the rich, the top 1%. Who are they? They are people who earn on an annual basis over $615,000 a year. That would put you in the upper 1%. Okay, so all three of these categories are in the upper 10%. They're just disaggregated into the upper 1%, and then the next category, the top 5% to the top 1%, and then the top 10% up to the top 5%. Okay, so it may be a little bit confusing, but all it says is you're looking at the very, very rich of the rich. The lines may look confusing, but there's actually a very key takeaway here that's secondary to what was on the previous slide. So what's the takeaway here? Everything else is the same as what I've explained before. You have higher proportions of the total income going to these rich individuals in the early years of the 20th century. The proportion flattens out during the 1950s, and somewhere in the mid-1970s, 1975 or thereabouts, the trajectory resumes an upward path. So that's the same. But here's what is very subtle and what's different. What we see when they decompose this upper 10% into the very, very rich is that the people who are getting much of that increase in income share is not everybody in the top 10%. It's the people in the top 1%, the top 1%. So in other words, if you only look at the 10% in the aggregate, you miss that subtlety. You miss the fact that that upward trajectory isn't the increase for everybody in that 10%. That upward trajectory is the result of the upper 1% getting a bigger and bigger share of the total pie in the economy. That's the very subtle takeaway. If you, all of you are here, I'm sure you are, well read. I'm sure you are people who are interested in these sorts of contemporary economic and social issues. So you probably know that over the last, years, recent years, even decade, maybe even decade and a half, we've had protests, we've had demonstrations across the country, and in some of those protests regarding economic inequality, you'll hear the chant, the 1% versus the 99%, and a common chant back during those protest days was, "We are the 99%. Well, where does that number come from? What does that mean? This is what it means. The 1% are the people represented by the black line, and the 99% is the rest of us, okay? So that's where that slogan comes from in the demonstrations. Okay, and then you can see if you go to 2022, the most recent year, you can see that that upper 1%, that class of individual earns almost one quarter of all the income that's generated by the US economy. That's rather staggering. They don't stop there. Professors Piketty and Saez go even further. They say, this is just that same chart before, but with the other two lines deleted so that you can see more clearly just the 1%. So that's the same thing as you saw here, but with the other two lines deleted, so it's easier to see what's happening to the top 1%. But they go one step further, and that's in the next slide. They say, let's further delineate and look at the top 0.1%. So this is the richest 1/10 of 1% of the population. So are you following that sort of logic? How are they doing? And the pattern is clear. Well, the overall pattern is the same as before. You have a very high proportion of income going to these super rich in the early part of the 20th century. It starts to flatten out, partly because of major events like the Great Depression, the World Wars. It flattens out and becomes relatively stable in the 1950s, the share of income that they get. But then somewhere around 1975, all the data point to this observation. Somewhere around the mid-1970s, the upward trajectory resumes. And then you see this rather dramatic upward trend, both for the top 1% and here for the top 0.1%. As of 2022, the richest 1/10 of 1% of the population earned a staggering almost 12% of all the income generated in the entire US economy. 11.8% doesn't sound like a big deal, right? 10%, relatively small number, is not like 50% or 40%. But you're talking about a very, very tiny sliver of the population that controls or earns almost 12% of all the income. So when you look at it in that broad perspective, it is rather startling, eye-popping. As economists, as social scientists, we often like to look at cross-checks. That is, what do other researchers say? What do other data tell us? Because if you only look always at one data set or one set of research results, sometimes you may not be convinced that the conclusions are really factually true. So it's always helpful, that's what scientists in general do, both social scientists and natural scientists. We look at a wide range of evidence, basically, right? The more evidence we have, the more confident we can be that the observations are in fact correct. And sure enough, other data by other sources lead us to the same basic conclusions. So this next slide shows us data from the US Census Bureau. The US Census Bureau, some of you may know, every month collects a massive amount of data through a survey instrument that they put out to the population at large. They go to about 60,000 households randomly selected across the US. And they asked these 60,000 or so households a large number of questions that pertain to the economy, their personal economic circumstances, people in those households, their demographic characteristics, their educational attainment, their earnings, their hours of work, so on and so forth. So it's a massive amount of data that's collected, and from that data, what we see is the same result. Although this data doesn't go as far back as the other data, it goes back only to the 1950s, but the general pattern remains the same, that the 95th percentile, which is the people who earn more than the 95% below them, they are the ones who've experienced a massive increase in their income share. This is real family income, so it's an alternative definition. It's no longer the share of total income, but it's what the average family earns in terms of real purchasing power. The 95th percentile, the richest 5% of the population, they experience an increase of over 200% compared to 1973. So over 200% means basically more than tripling of family income in real terms accrue to that group. Other groups, those in the median, the middle part of the population, and those who are in the 20th percentile, which are the poorest 20%, they experience increases, but relatively modest ones. So if you look at all these decades, the trajectory is fairly flat for those in these other groups. But the 95th percentile, they've benefited tremendously over this time. I should point out, to go back to the earlier data by Piketty and Saez, their data are based on IRS income tax returns. And so this is why I point out that the more evidence you have looking at different sources, the more confident you can be. So the earlier data were from random Internal Revenue Service income tax data, often based on random audits that are conducted by the IRS, whereas this is from the current population survey from the Census Bureau. Okay, so we have similar results. And we have a third confirming source of information. These are data from the Congressional Budget Office. And these analyses are compiled by the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, but they're based on data from the Congressional Budget Office. The CBO, as all of you hopefully know, is a nonpartisan part of Congress that does analysis to assist our representatives and senators in Congress with understanding economic trends and so on. So what the CBO has found is, once again, similar pattern. They don't go as far back as 1950, but what you can kind of infer is that if you start with the 70s and 80s, things were relatively more equal, but once you go past the mid-70s and early 80s, what you see is this tremendous explosion in the income. This is income gains of households. Those in the top 1% of households earn a whopping 326% increase in their income. Other demographic groups also experienced increases, but much more modest increases. So I guess to reiterate, there is a clear pattern here, irrespective of what data source you use, irrespective of what study you look at. There's a clear pattern here, the pattern that I've enunciated several times. This high proportion in the early part of the century, 20th century, the stabilization of it, the leveling out of it in the mid-50s, but then by the mid-70s, a gradual explosion of more and more inequality once again. That's what we have seen. All of the data that you see so far, as I alluded to earlier, are based on income data before taxes and transfer payments. So as I said earlier, this is something I'll get back to, and so here I have to reiterate, you have to understand that everything I've showed you so far means that it's income people get from market activities before they pay taxes and before they get any government support. So purely personal income derived from the market. But many people would argue, and this is also going to come back again further down the line, which I'll explain later, Many people argue, but that's not really the best way to measure income, because we have a progressive income tax system in which richer individuals pay a higher tax rate, so they're going to be paying more taxes. So if you look at not their market income, but their after-tax income, they're not really as rich as you think. So that the picture we've painted may not be accurate in the sense that we're overestimating inequality, because we're not reflecting the fact that the rich are actually paying more taxes, so they're not as rich as you think, okay? And likewise, on the other end of things, if you exclude transfer payments, government subsidies to people on the lower end of the income ladder, if you ignore those, then really one can argue that those poorer people are actually richer than you think. They're not really as poor because they're getting these government subsidies. And so many people would argue, well, what would happen if you measure income by looking at what people get after they've paid taxes and after they've received these government subsidies, right? That seems to be, I think, a plausible way to look at it. But here's the thing. That has been done. At least right here, I'll show you some of the results. It's more controversial because, as you'll see later on, some others have found even more dramatic revisions to the conclusions, okay? But let me start with this. If you look at this, this is data from the Congressional Budget Office, once again, the CBO. If you look at this, the left-hand side, the left-hand bar, shows you the distribution of income before transfers and taxes. So this would be comparable to the data that you've seen up to this point, okay? We don't include taxes, we don't include transfers to the poor. And what you see is a staggering high rate of inequality, where the top 1% earn 17% of the total income. But the CBO performed this analysis and asked, well, what if you look at the distribution of income after you include transfer payments to the poor and taxes, presumably higher taxes that have been paid by the rich? What would happen? And you see there is a slight change, but it doesn't fundamentally alter the overarching conclusion, which is that there is still quite a bit of skewness or bias in the distribution of income. Namely, even after you account for taxes and transfer payments, the upper 1% still earn or control a whopping 13% of the total income in the economy. Sure, that's smaller than 17%, so it's a slight improvement because, as I said, you're taking into account the fact that the rich do pay more taxes, right, on a relative basis, and you're taking into account that the poor are getting support, so they're not really as poor as you think. So sure, it's going to modify the results, but the modification, as I said, isn't that significant, isn't that dramatic. It's still quite a bit of a gap. And likewise, the people in the middle, sure, the number gets smaller, but only marginally so. So once again, the people down here, likewise, there isn't a significant change. So the overarching conclusion that there is still quite a bit of unevenness or inequality in the distribution of U.S. income, I think to most people, it still remains. The conclusion still remains pretty valid, okay? But subject to what you'll see in a little bit. I'll show you even more evidence. Okay. I know Bailey mentioned that you're welcome to ask questions at the end, but there's so much here that I always feel guilty that I don't stop if you do have questions. Let me give you the opportunity to ask questions. I'd be happy to. So I saw this hand first. Please go ahead.
Is Social Security in the transfers bucket?
Yes. So those would be all kinds of transfers, such as that, or what we now call SNAP payments, what formerly had been called food stamps, things like that. So yes, all different kinds of transfers. But as you'll see later, it depends how many transfers you include. So if you have a study that only includes some of the transfers and other studies that include more of all the different kinds of transfers, then you might get different results as well. Okay, so yes. So I think Cheryl is next.
Yes, I did. So I was thinking back to the 0.1% and the percentages, and I was wondering if you could correct me if my thinking is not correct. It's like, say, it's like a 0.1% or say 1 for you and 110 for me.
That's right.
Okay.
That's right. So if you think of, in terms of, let's say, a dollar, right? Think of it in monetary terms. 1% of a dollar would be 1 penny, right? Right? So 0.1% would be 1/10 of a penny, okay? So if you think of it that way, then now if you transit over to people on the income ladder, then that's how small the sliver is of the number of people at that highest echelon. It's really a tiny, tiny group. You're talking about, you know, I don't mean to pick on individuals, but you know, the Jeff Bezoses and the, yes, the Bill Gates, people like that.
But, you know, kids play a game where they say 1 for me, 2 for you, 2 for me, 1 for you. And so I was like, okay, for a 0.1 percenter, that's 1 for you, but 110 for me.
Yeah, if I understand you correctly, I think that's another way to put it, sure. Absolutely. Absolutely. That's right. That's right. That's right, yeah. Once you get down to the decimal places, even I sometimes have to sit down and make sure I understand the logic of it. I understand 5%, 10%. When you go to 0.1, and then sometimes some studies go to the 0.01%. That's really scary, right? Then you have to really think through, well, how many people are in that 0.01% category?
I'm just moving decimal points.
That's right. So, okay, I saw other hands, so I'm sorry. Oh, Art, please.
There was a number of decades where the income levels tracked pretty close forward.
Yeah.
So what has economists figured out how we can return to an area where we can be more like those decades? Well,
Sure.
there's one in there. I know I saw it.
Sure. This one, yeah, if you look at the entire 10%, that flattening out. But if you look at this one,
Yeah.
yes.
See those?
Well, yes.
Even better one.
And there's an even better one, you're right,
Track.
which is this one.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
And so have
Yeah.
economists figured out
Sure, let me
what
get this.
happened then and how we can turn that curve back
Sure.
to a point where,
Sure.
is that through income taxes? Is it through some other kind of capital gains adjustment? Or what is the secret sauce? That for
So,
decades, we were
as-
able to maintain that.
As I prepared mentally for tonight's presentation before driving here, that's exactly the question I was anticipating. I knew somebody would ask that, so I thought I'd better be sure I had a good answer for it. So, but let me answer that, but I think you were going to interject something.
Well, it's a line. I'm looking at the brown line, which I think was the lowest. But on here, you see how the group above on the blue
Yes.
actually ends up being below the lowest. And I'm wondering, is that what we call like the working poor, where we're at a level where we can't get any kind of government backing? So literally,
Yeah.
even though we're working, we're less than people who are not working or getting more subsidies because we fall into that sphere.
That's exactly right. First of all, the first part of your observation, when the lines are this close, it's really not possible to delineate where they are relative to each other. So you would have to, as it were, put a magnifying glass on top of that and then expand that section of the curve, then you get a better picture. What we do is, the charts are the results of drawing out tables of numbers. So you would have to go back to the table that has the actual numbers. That would give you a better, sort of a more granular view, okay? Here, it's really hard to tell which line is higher because they're so close together. But then to get to your more important point, which is, yes, the blue line is the line representing people in the so-called 20th percentile. Percentile means people who are earning less than 80% of the population. In other words, 80% of the population earn more than they do. Okay? So they're the poorest 20%. And yes, they've experienced growth in their income, but over many decades, the growth has been modest. Okay? And this is a little bit on the technical side, but what we're comparing is, what are they doing in the 21st century compared to what they were getting in 1973? Because that was the time period when the split seems to have occurred. Now, to get back to Art's question, I think that's the $64 million question. What's the secret sauce? Because if we knew that, then we could just reverse engineer everything and return ourselves to the nice time that we had earlier on where things were more equal, right? Assuming that you think inequality is a bad thing, which obviously I'm not here to judge. People have different views about whether inequality is actually good or bad. I can allude to that later on. In my previous talks on inequality, I actually talk about that. But as I added more and more things to my presentation, I had to sort of delete things to make sure everything fits into an hour. So one thing I had to delete was arguments for inequality. Believe it or not, there are arguments for inequality, okay? But anyway, to go back to Art's question, economists have wrestled with this. We've done a lot of research. I would, based on everything I've read and understand, I would point to the following events, both domestically and globally, that have perhaps led to the observation that it was roughly in the mid-70s where this divergence occurred, okay? And those events, in my opinion, are as follows. First, that was the time period when rapid advances in technology started to take hold, okay? Now, it's true, we didn't have a full-fledged desktop computer until the early 1980s. But the beginning of that computer revolution really started in the mid-70s because Bill Gates dropped out of Harvard, I think somewhere around 1975. So you're beginning to see the inklings of this massive innovation, which started in the mid-70s, late 80s, and by the time you get to the early 80s, like I said, everybody basically has a desktop computer. So the dramatic rise in technological progress is one factor economists have discovered that has led to this divergence. And the common sense of it is, if you have more technology, faster technology, more advanced technology, the reason it creates potential inequality is because those who are able to keep up with that advancing technology on an accelerating pace, they're rewarded. Because if you can keep up, you're more productive because you can work with that new technology, you'll be better compensated, okay? Those who cannot keep up, and I hasten to add that many people who cannot keep up, it may not be due to their own fault. They don't keep up or cannot keep up because of factors beyond their control. They don't have the resources to invest in education or training programs. They may have family or other personal constraints that prevent them from developing their human capital. So it's not necessarily their own fault, but whatever the cause, the result is that if they don't keep up, they are less productive relative to those who do keep up with the technology, and that's why you see that growing gap. So that's one factor, technology. A second factor is, if you think about it, and I'm sure all of you are well read, if you go back to the history of it, this is the time period when, after World War II, countries were rapidly rebuilding to augment their infrastructure. And by the 1970s, you're talking about countries that have come back in full force, right? Think back to Japan. We even back then had a term called Japan bashing, because Japan had become so successful in the 20 or 30 years after the Second World War that they were now like one of our leading competitors, okay? Not so much today, but back then they were a major threat. And then multiply that by other countries across the world. By the late 1970s, by 1978 to be exact, you had China come onto the scene, because China in 1978, after the passing of Chairman Mao, embarked on a massive campaign of reform to orient their economy towards a market-type system, as opposed to being a centralized command system. And the result was a tremendous explosion in innovation, entrepreneurship, and success. From the late 70s all the way up to the 1990s, China was the fastest growing economy in the world, growing over 10% a year. It became the manufacturing powerhouse. To this day, much of what we see at Walmart comes from China, okay? So in other words, globalization, the opening up of countries that have rapidly recovered from World War II, that are now integrated into the economy, that openness facilitated by multilateral negotiations that encourage freer and freer trade, that globalization process exacerbated inequality, because now you have American workers who have to compete not only with other domestic workers, but foreign workers, okay? So you have, to summarize, technology, and you have globalization. And I think the consensus among economists is that those are perhaps the two leading causes of the results that we see. and it remains a contentious debate on the part of professional economists. There are prominent economists who argue that technology has been the most important factor. But you have equally prominent economists who argue that no, technology may have been important, may have played a role, but it's the globalization that has been the major factor. Isn't a completely resolved issue, okay? I would add a third element, okay, as I was thinking through this. So the third element I would add is, I don't know how much you remember of those times, but this was also the time of rapid change in government policy, government activity. In particular, starting in the late 1970s with President Carter, I think that's really one of the watershed moments. The US federal government embarked on a pretty wide campaign of deregulation, right? We deregulated the airlines, the rail systems, and gradually, that was the late 70s. By the time President Reagan was elected, going into the 80s, that process of deregulation continued unabated. And then if you push forward to the 1990s, you had deregulation of the financial markets, which unleashed a massive wave of activity that benefited very much people in the financial sector, not so much people in the old-fashioned industrial manufacturing sector, let's say, okay? So if you put all this together, the rapid acceleration in technology, the integration of the global economy so that countries were becoming more integrated and therefore they had to compete more vigorously with each other. And then you have this change in government policy stance where we allowed the free market to work more and more. We deregulated. The government's policy was to try to keep its hands off more than it did before. It's a toxic mixture. I'm not sure if toxic is the right word. That's kind of value laden. I shouldn't use toxic, but it was like a convergence of what you might call what's the term? A perfect storm. That's what I'm looking for, a perfect storm. So I hope that kind of answers your question. I would conclude by saying that it's not definitive. As I said, different prominent people argue along different lines. So I prefer to take an eclectic approach. I think all three of those things probably play a roughly equal role, but I'm just one voice, okay? There are some who argue technology is the culprit, others who say government policy, okay? The relaxation of regulation has been the culprit, yet others say it's the globalization process that has caused this growth in inequality. Okay, so excellent questions. Are there others, Cheryl?
Just in those 3 or 4 that you mentioned as forces, how would you align the free trade and the fall of union and unionized participation?
The fall of what?
Of unionized participation in the
Yeah.
manufacturing sector.
Sure.
Is it paired with one of those 3, or is it
Absolutely. Absolutely. It would be what you call a secondary bullet point to my third point, which is it's hard to pinpoint the exact date, but somewhere around that period, government policy, public attitudes, as well as actual negotiations between companies and their workers, it showed a remarkable shift away from historically what were fairly protective measures and policies and attitudes towards union workers, gradually moving away from that, and again, most notably in court rulings, government regulatory activity that favored less and less union activity, union workers. You have the growth in so-called right-to-work states, right? And the most obvious evidence of the declining influence of unionism is if you look at the percentage of the workforce that's unionized, it fell very, very dramatically over this time period. So that's, I think, a subset of the government policy changes I talk about. The fact that the protections that we had historically accorded to unions simply began to weaken, okay? And to this day, I think there's a continued controversy. Again, I don't know how much you have read about this, but for instance, many economists argue that even in the most recent period, like in the last 10 years or so, and even more recent, many companies, because of the weakening of the protection of union workers, many companies have imposed on workers so-called non-compete clauses, right? Where if you work for a company, you're required to sign a contract that says, if you leave our company, you are prohibited from either working for another company for a certain time period, or if you do, you're prohibited from bringing any knowledge or expertise that you learned while you were at our company, bringing it over there, right? Non-compete clauses. And again, the conclusion is still not definitive, but there are some economists who argue that has been one of the major factors why workers have really not kept up as much as we would have liked, right? Stagnation of real wages because of the weakening of their bargaining power. All of these other things, including what you've mentioned, in government policy, unions, all of that, I think, is that third element I mentioned, in addition to globalization and technology. So, yes.
If between 1920 and 2020 you overlaid U.S. tax brackets over this, because I think at one point the top tax bracket was like 70% or 90% or something.
Exactly.
Is there much correlation between the flattening of the tax brackets and this inequality?
I don't know how strict the correlation is, but what you do often hear economists point out is the following, that in our recent past, the argument has been, and this has been, in fact, the major impetus for the tax cuts that were passed when President Trump was in office in his first term, right, in 2017, a major milestone. And the rationale for cutting taxes was that compared to other countries, the US is no longer as competitive because our corporate tax rates are so high, right? We have to lower them so that they're comparable to other countries. But to get to your point, many economists on the opposing side of that debate argue that if you overlay what you're suggesting, income tax rates throughout this course of history, what you see is that there's no strong correlation. So if there is a correlation, it is in fact perhaps the opposite of what you would think. That in the periods where our tax rates were much higher, we were actually doing quite well in terms of prosperity, income growth, the evenness or the degree of evenness in the distribution of income. We saw less inequality. So there may be a correlation, but it seems to be the opposite of what you would think, is what the other side would argue.
And I guess my question would go more to wealth than does to income,
Yeah.
because you're taking wealth and you're redistributing it through taxes, and that would impact wealth more than income, right?
Absolutely. So we have to be careful. I'm going to have a slide coming up that talks about wealth as well. So as you correctly point out, income and wealth are two different things. Unfortunately, people confuse them all the time. They associate one with the other, and they are correlated, right? Higher income people typically have higher wealth, but they're different things. Income is what we call a flow item, a flow variable where, like your salary, it comes on a regular basis, right? Wealth refers to what we might call a stock of assets, things like the house that you own, the cars that you own, your investment portfolio, your stocks and bonds. Those are assets that represent a stock of value rather than a continuing flow of value. So they're very different. But as you'll see, as I'll point out later, economists have looked at the distribution of wealth, and the same pattern emerges. The distribution of wealth, if anything, is even more unequal than the distribution of income. So the two go hand in hand. But to go back to your first fundamental point, which is there any connection to tax rates? So I hope what I explained was clear. It's not definitive, but if there is a connection, it's not the one that most people think. They think that lowering taxes actually will improve things. But the history seems to teach us actually the reverse, that even when we had very high tax rates, we were actually doing quite well. But it's an ongoing kind of research question, okay? So wonderful questions, thank you. Are there any others so far? Great. Okay, great. So I hope I'm not keeping all of you over time. Let me check the clock. If I am, I think Bailey will just pull out the cane and yank me off the stage, right? So, okay, good. I have a few more minutes, so I will try to streamline, but don't let that stop you from asking questions. So let me go back to where I left off. Oh, so this is where I left off. So even if you factor in taxes and transfer payments, the distribution proportion-wise doesn't change very much. That was the main conclusion. But now this is the slide that shows us wealth distribution, and as I said, wealth is even more concentrated. So if you look at the distribution of wealth before taxes, the distribution of income before taxes, this is what it looks like. But now if you look at wealth, remember income is a flow of earnings, for instance, but wealth is stocks of assets like investment portfolios, houses, cars, antiques, right? Monet paintings, right? Those kinds of things are stocks of wealth. And you see a staggering 35% of all the wealth in the country is owned by the top 1% of the population, right? That's a very staggering degree of inequality as well. The bottom 90%, right? The bottom 90% of the income distribution, they control less than 1/3, only 27% of the total wealth, the assets in the country. So that's wealth. And just like for income, wealth concentration has been rising since the 70s. So the chart shows the same pattern as the previous charts, except that this refers to the share of total wealth. So that the blue line is the richest, the top 1%. The yellow line is the top 0.5%. So the richest of the rich in terms of the ownership of wealth, assets. That has been growing up. After stabilizing in the mid-20th century, that has once again resumed this upward trajectory. The next slide shows that there is a racial component, unfortunately, as well, especially when it comes to wealth. I think most of us know and have seen statistics on racial differences when it comes to income, right? So I'm going to show you some statistics later on as well about earnings by race. But the concentration is especially noticeable for wealth by race. So here's what it looks like. If you start in the middle of the chart, this is the median, which is the people in the population who are in the middle of the income distribution. The 50 percentile, meaning 50% of households have more and 50% have less. So these are the people in the middle. Of those households in the middle, the orange bar represents white families, white households. In 2022, white households owned about $285,000 of wealth. In more formal terms, wealth is simply assets minus liabilities. So everything you own in terms of assets that are valuable minus all your debts that you owe other people. So that's what we call net worth, right? Assets minus liabilities. And so that's what that says. White households had close to $300,000 worth of wealth, assets minus liabilities. The yellow bar represents Latino households. They earned or controlled only about $61,000 worth of assets, wealth, I should say, assets minus liabilities. And the last bar refers to Black or African American households. They controlled less than $45,000 worth of wealth as of 2022. So that's among the middle. If you look at the far right, these are the really rich households, those in the 90th percentile. In that upper echelon, white families control a staggering more than $2.5 million worth of wealth, assets minus liabilities. So these would be, again, mansions, houses, fancy cars, stock portfolios, so on and so forth, assets. More than $2.5 million. At that upper echelon, there are people who are wealthy, who are Latino or Black or African American, but those ethnic categories do much worse. The Latino households only have just over $500,000 worth of wealth, and Black or African American households had also just slightly more than $500,000 worth of wealth. Okay, so the disparity there is quite dramatic. And then if you go to the far left, you look at households who are in the poorest 10% of the population, the 10th percentile. You can't really even see the bars because there's not enough there to rise up, but the numbers are still there. So among white households in that poorest group, the white households controlled just over $5,000 worth of wealth. Latino households only had about $200 worth of wealth, and Black or African American households actually had a negative wealth amount, negative $11,000, which means their liabilities were greater than their assets, which means they were in debt. They actually owed people more money on balance, okay? So that's the staggering degree of inequality when it comes to wealth, and it reinforces what we know about income disparities too. Okay, so everything I've told you so far is for the national economy. It pertains to the entire US economy. But I'm sure all of you are interested in what is true in our area, right? What does the degree of inequality look like for Erie? So I hope this will help. I compiled some statistics. The problem when you go down to a disaggregated geographical level is that the granular data that is available at the national level is no longer available, right? For various reasons such as confidentiality, we can't really go to the income tax returns of people in one local area. The government often fears that if this is available, you can, by inference, figure out who's earning how much money, right? And all that's confidential. So for confidentiality reasons, we often can't get access to that kind of granular data. So, we have to do a workaround, and the workaround is, fortunately, there is another very common, very standard way to measure inequality. And I'm not going to go too wonky here to go into the technical details. I'll just explain it to you from an intuitive, common sense perspective. The alternative measure is something called the Gini index or the Gini coefficient of income inequality. Okay? In my other lectures, I explain it, but as I said, the more I add to my presentations over time, the more time it fills up, so I have to start deleting things that used to be there. So that's the technical explanation is gone. Let me give you the intuitive explanation. All this says is that it's a number that will fall between 0 and 1. So it's going to be a decimal number, like 0.3, 0.4, 0.5, okay? Greater than 0, less than 1. And if you go to the polar extremes, the polar opposites, if that Gini coefficient were to be exactly 0, that would be a situation where the economy or that location is experiencing what we might call perfect equality. That is, there is no inequality. In the sense that if the coefficient were 0, the way it's defined, it would mean, for instance, that the 10% poorest of the population, they earn 10% of the income. The poorest 20% earn 20% of the income. The poorest 30% earn 30% of the total income. So the amount of earnings proportionately rises commensurately with the cumulative share of population, so that in a sense, there's no unevenness. Income is perfectly evenly distributed, okay? No such country, no such city experiences that kind of perfect equality, obviously, right? So that's just like the textbook ideal case. If, on the other hand, the coefficient were to be a perfect 1, then we would have perfect inequality. That would mean income is so unequally distributed that, for instance, one family might control all the income and perhaps all the wealth, and everybody else gets nothing. That's how unequal it is, okay? It's so severe that one person or one family controls everything, okay? Obviously, no place on earth also is at that other polar extreme. Most cities, most countries are gonna fall somewhere in between. Gini coefficient is gonna be somewhere between 0 and 1. So that's, I think, an easier way to understand it without the technical details. And here's what things look like. I compare the country as a whole to the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, to Erie, and then I also looked up all the 67 counties in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania and calculated the average Gini coefficient across all 67 counties so that we can see Erie in relation to the state and the nation, but also in relation to other counties in the Commonwealth, right? So you have a pretty comprehensive view of where we stand relative to these other places. Okay, so what does this picture say? First, the bad news. The bad news is that the blue bar on the left for all places refers to 2010, so more than 10 years ago. The purple bar on the right for all places refers to 2023, the latest data that we have available. And so the bad news is what you see in all locales, whether it's the country as a whole, the Commonwealth as a whole, Erie, PA, or the average across all Pennsylvania counties, the bar has become taller, which means the Gini coefficient has gotten bigger, which means we're closer to that end of things. Things have gotten more unequal. So this is consistent with all the earlier data that I've shown you that pertain just to the national economy. We see that even in Erie and across the Pennsylvania counties, we see that there has been a growth in inequality. So that's kind of the bad news. The good news is, if you look more carefully, Erie actually does better compared to the nation and the Commonwealth as a whole. In other words, our Gini coefficients are actually slightly lower than the Gini coefficients for the country and for Pennsylvania. So we, in comparison, are closer to the other side, more equal, okay? Yes, Cheryl?
We're more equal, but we also thought about, another index number that would say either how wealthy we are or what our income is. Are we below the U.S. average, or the U.S. figure, or the Pennsylvania figure? So we could be more equal, but not as prosperous, is what I'm asking.
Right. As I said earlier, it would be ideal if we had more data at the local level, for disaggregated places like counties and cities as opposed to states and the country. But we don't have that kind of granular data, so I think this is the best we can do in terms of comparable comparisons between the nation, the state, and the county of Erie. Okay, so in the future, hopefully, technology will enable us to compile more data, more granular data. But so far, I'm afraid we're kind of constrained by this. Okay, but that's a good observation. Okay, so good. Any other questions? The next slide shows you the trend I've mentioned. So throughout the course of the last decade, and also if you go even further back to 1970, you'll see that in all three places, the country as a whole, the red line, the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, the green line, and Erie, despite short-term fluctuations, there is a long-term upward trajectory in terms of the Gini index, going up, reflecting gradually greater and greater inequality. You won't be able to see everything in this slide, but if I tell you what it represents, you can understand it. I basically tell you what the Gini index is for all 67 counties. So maybe you can read some of that. So for instance, the most unequal county in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania is Philadelphia County. It has a Gini index of 0.52, over 0.5. It's kind of unusual, although not impossible, to have a Gini that's more than 0.5. Usually you see it between 0.3 and 0.4. So it's over 0.5 in Philadelphia. The most equal county in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania is Mifflin County in the central part of the Commonwealth, right, just southeast of Center County. They have a Gini index of 0.4. And then you can see, here's where we stand. The US is here, the Gini is 0.48, Pennsylvania 0.47, and Erie 0.46. So we're slightly more equal than the nation and the state, but we're more unequal compared to the average degree of inequality across all 67 counties. Okay? I hope that's not too much or too dense information to absorb. Yes, please.
Does it make sense that the more populated centers are kind of more unequal than the more rural centers?
I'm sorry, I didn't catch the first part.
So does it make sense that most of them that are more towards the equal end are more rural because most of the population is poor, where you have a bigger kind of distribution of people in the more populated centers? Is that why? Right,
that's an outstanding question. And the answer is you cannot tell why a certain place is more equal or unequal. That's another research area that is highly important, which this does not cover. So it's a great question, and it would be fascinating to social scientists like me to ask, well, how come Mifflin is so much more equal compared to Philadelphia? As you can probably imagine, it's probably based on like a million different factors, some economic, some demographic, some historical, some cultural, some political, some institutional, some cultural, right? You get the idea? All of those things are going to influence whether a place, even attitudes, things you can't measure, right? If people in a particular locale place more emphasis on making sure that people are are receiving even shares of income, that's going to push policy in one direction. If you have places where people are more insistent on letting the market work, even if it generates inequality, then you're going to have a more unequal. So it's hard to say, but it's an important research question. Okay? Yes, Cheryl.
Just thought experiment-wise, would it be a step in the right direction to consider your proposition, to look at those numbers and then also have the range? Have a range, a high, the highest.
Absolutely.
The highest and the lowest. And then if you noticed that looking at Mifflin, because it's right there, looking at Mifflin, they had the narrowest range of, I don't know,
Sure.
income or something like that.
Yeah.
You'd say it's more homogeneous in terms of the earning capacity or the income or something like that, and happen to also have the least disparity.
Yeah, it's a matter of listing all the potential causes of either greater equality or greater inequality and using formal statistical methods to disentangle from that long list of reasons which are the most important reasons. Is it industrial structure, the fact that that county is moving from manufacturing to healthcare so that healthcare offers a more even distribution? Is it because of politics? Is it because of electoral issues? Is it because of historical factors? Is it because of geography? Right? If you're located right at the riverbank, that may play a role. So all those factors.
So I was being lazier than causality. I wasn't driving towards causality. True confession. That was my lazy thought was looking at the ranges. Excuse me for using the term income, but looking at the ranges of income might come close to, I thought, what I was hearing you ask. And I wasn't being very rigorous about it.
No, that's a good reminder for us. I'm sure you've heard the old adage, correlation does not imply causation. So that's another aspect to keep in mind if you were to do this kind of exercise, that just because you see there's a relationship, it doesn't necessarily mean that one causes the other, that there's cause and effect. And economists spend a lot of time, trust me, on trying to figure out whether in fact it is cause and effect. And often we don't know. Okay, so that's the 67 counties. Are you sure you're not tired of listening to me? Because I've gone, it's like 10 minutes over. So I'm happy to continue, but if you're tired, I'd also be happy to have Bailey tell me to stop.
No.
Or let me put it this way. I'll continue, but I'm not offended if you get up and leave, okay? So if you're tired, you're tired of listening to me, please don't hesitate. I'm not offended, okay? Please.
Just out of curiosity, what is the population correlation between Philadelphia and Mifflin?
You mean in terms of population size?
Yes.
Oh, okay. Honestly, I didn't look up the population. I would imagine Mifflin's going to be much smaller, right? But what are the actual numbers? I don't know. That's easily ascertainable. It's online. But I didn't look that up. So sure, population size, very, very different. Yes.
So just generally speaking, the happy countries, Denmark, Finland,
Yeah.
all of them, and for that matter, like Western Europe, where they have more socialist policies, and that, I take it that their indexes are way more equal.
Absolutely. Yeah. I'm going to show you a slide. Assuming you are patient enough to stay with me, you'll see a slide later that shows you how the U.S. is among the most unequal countries in the world when it comes to income distribution. Okay, so yes, the Gini coefficient will be much smaller in those places that you've listed. Okay, so I see no takers. I've given you the chance to leave, so I'm going to keep pushing ahead. But do feel free if you want to leave. Okay, so these are the 67 counties. Then I dug even deeper into the weeds. I asked, in our beloved Erie County, which parts of our county are most equal and which parts are most unequal, right? So this is a map of all the places within the county. We call them census tracts. So they're districts that are even more finely defined. So we call them census tracts, a limited amount of space, the population within that limited space. So there are a lot of numbers here. I rank order the degree of inequality as measured by the Gini index from highest to lowest based on census tract. So the most unequal census tract that has the highest Gini, over 0.6, is census tract census tract 9.02. So where is that? probably can't see it, but I'll point it out to you. It's right there in the heart of the city. So it's roughly between 5th and 9th Streets, roughly around Sassafras. Okay? So bounded on the north by 5th Street, I think on the south by 9th Street, and I think the eastern boundary is like Sassafras. I think that's my recollection. Okay, so if you're from Erie, you can kind of imagine the area I'm talking about. That is the place with the most unequal distribution of income. Okay, looking only at people there, income is highly skewed. Okay, what's the other end? The census tract that is most equal with a Gini coefficient that is below 0.4. It's only 0.32, and that census tract 117.02. Where is that? It's the far eastern edge of Erie County, in a place I think called Greenfield Township. If I remember correctly, Greenfield Township. It's a little bit southeast of the city, but it's like on the eastern edge, right at the edge of Erie County. That's the most equal place. But you know, it's interesting because the earlier question was, why is one place more equal or more unequal? Same question applies here, right? What makes Greenfield County special that it ends up with a more equal distribution as opposed to the central district in the city that's so unequal? Again, a great social science question. We would have to disentangle all of those potential causes. Okay. Okay, then I move to the next part, and raise your hand if it doesn't make sense, because this is going to be even more technical, so I apologize in advance. But Ben Spigen, the vice president of the Jefferson Educational Society, I think he invited me to give this talk partly because he heard me talk about this, and I think Cheryl and Art were at our conference last year when I presented this. But Ben was so intrigued that he wanted me to, you know, educate the community on this. Every year we have a conference at Penn State Barron put on by the research institute that I direct. And if all of you are interested, make sure you contact me, because this year's conference is already being set up. It will be on Wednesday, July 23rd. Wednesday, July 23rd. Each year we focus on a theme that is important and timely for the Erie community. So keep that in mind, and I hope you'll join us. That's just a shameless plug for the conference that's coming up. But anyway, last year we had a conference where I talked about this, and this is the analysis. We're talking about inequality, right? Inequality. So what I did was I compiled statistics on the annual earnings of people in different demographic groups. So you can see here in the upper part of this chart, white workers, Black or African American workers, Hispanic and Asian workers. I look at how many people are in their prime working age years. So this is the number of people between ages of 16 and 64. And then in each of these demographic groups, what percent of that total population is in that category? And then I ask, what is the median earnings of people in that group? So that if you multiply columns A, B, and C, what you get is the contribution to the economy by each of those groups. And the bottom line figure is the total contribution when you look at all white workers, all Black or African American workers, all Hispanic workers, all Asian workers. So as of 2022, and this is only for men, the next chart does the same thing for women. As of 2022, all these demographic groups contributed $4.5 billion to the Erie economy. But here's the catch. You'll note that the different groups earn different annual earnings. So a popular methodology that is increasingly becoming more common now is economists are asking, that may reflect inequality. Suppose we were to get rid of that inequality. So kind of like what Cheryl said, let's do a thought experiment. Suppose we paid everybody the same wage that the typical white worker gets. So that I change all these numbers down here so that everybody gets paid what white workers get paid, instead of the lower wages that are typically paid to Black or African Americans and Hispanic workers, okay? Asian workers typically have slightly higher average earnings, so I leave that the same. But I raise everybody else's wage to the level of the white worker. And then I crank through the same question. What would be the contribution by these groups if things were made more equal like that, so that everybody is paid what the average white worker gets paid. And what you see is the result out here. The result is that the contribution goes up to almost $4.7 billion, which means if you equalize things in the sense that everybody gets paid what white workers on average get paid, you basically boost the economy. You're getting rid of the inequality, and that was the theme of our conference last year. What are the potential benefits from having greater equity across the income distribution? Okay? Yes, Cheryl.
And I could read that, since it's in billions,
Yes.
as $160 million a year.
That's right. The gain to Erie would be $160 million a year. That's exactly right. If we were to, that would be the difference in these two numbers, if we were to eliminate those earnings gaps. Exactly right. Okay, great. Then the next slide, I do the same thing for women. So the previous slide was the thought experiment. If you equalize things for men, you have this gain to the Erie economy. What if you equalize things for women so that you paid all women the same wage that you paid white women? Because ordinarily, Black or African American women and Hispanic women, they typically get paid less. What if you paid them the same wage that you paid white women? Same results, right? You get a boost to the economy. For women, the boost is slightly lower. It's about 3 million, okay? But that's nothing to sneeze at. That's still quite a bit of a bump. And then in the last slide, I say, well, what if you equalize things not only on the basis of race, but on the basis of gender? That is, you pay everybody what white men get, right? Because white men, if you look at the numbers, they are the ones who have the highest average earnings. So if you pay everybody what white men get paid, then you're saying there's no longer any difference because of gender or sex, and there's also no longer any difference in terms of race, because everybody's getting paid according to what white men get paid, right? So you're eliminating racial and gender earnings gaps. What do we see? Same thought experiment. What we see is a dramatic increase in the contribution to the Erie economy, if that were to happen. The contribution is a whopping it actually is 765 million, but it rounds up to 770 million. A whopping $770 million. That, to give you a sense of perspective, represents almost 7% of Erie's total GDP, what we call gross domestic product. So fully, I think something like 6.8% of the size of the Erie economy, we can boost that economy by 7% to the tune of $770 million if we were to luckily eliminate those earnings gaps on the basis of race and gender. Okay, so that's why Ben, I think, invited me to talk about income inequality. These are the numbers that tell us that. Now, I know, I'm running substantial overtime, but I'll quickly add, this is just like a very simple thought experiment. It's not definitive because, if you study this issue, you come to realize there are many qualifications you have to keep in mind. So for instance, one important qualification is that the reason some workers may get paid less is not because they are discriminated against or the economy is unfair to them. It may be due to other things that are beyond everybody's control. So lack of resources to invest in education may mean that certain workers get paid less because they have less human capital through no fault of their own, okay? So in other words, the differences may be due to differences in educational attainment or to experience or to years of tenure on the job. That could be the reason, or those could be the reasons for the differences in earnings. So that's one qualification among many. Having said that, however, what the research literature tells us is that even if you were to control for things like education and experience, that is, if you assume people have the same educational attainment, unfortunately the data still give us the same result, that Black and African American men and women and Latino men and women, they still earn less than the average white worker, even if you compare comparable workers who have similar levels of education, similar levels of skill, and so on and so forth. So that leads us, even though there are qualifications, that leads us to a fairly strong conclusion that, yeah, there probably is some gap that isn't justified, that hopefully we can eliminate, okay? So that's Erie, and I'm sorry if that's too technical, but I hope you get the overall point. Okay, so I'll quickly run through some of the critiques that, of everything that you've seen. In terms of fairness, the other side, what do people say who argue that, well, it isn't as bad as you think? Well, there are many critiques. You may have read some of them, but because of the time constraint, I'll point to two very recent critiques. This is a book published in 2022 by three individuals. You may recognize the first gentleman. He was a US Senator for many years, Phil Gramm. But before becoming US Senator, he was actually an economics professor at Texas A&M University. So he knows his stuff, right? And then the other two are also, one of them is an econ professor, the other was a government official at the Bureau of Labor Statistics. And it's a very finely written book. They're meticulous in their documentation, so if you have a chance, I hope you'll get a chance to peruse it. But I pulled out a few of their major overarching conclusions. What they argue is that the statistics that you've seen me present, which most people cite, they do not take into account all of the taxes and all of the transfer payments that exist. And therefore, as I said earlier, if rich people really are paying a lot more taxes and you're not including all the taxes they pay, then you may think that they're getting more income, but really, once you factor in their higher taxes, they're not as rich as you think. And likewise, if you're not including all the transfer payments, the poor people are actually not as poor as you think because they're getting these transfer payments that you're not including, okay? So by omitting everything, you're biasing the result. That's their main argument. They go so far as to make these two quotations that I've cited here. They say, if you account for all transfer payments and all taxes, it will yield a measure of income inequality that is only 1/4 as large as the official census number that I cited earlier, right? Only 1/4 as big, a substantial reduction in the degree of inequality. They go further, one step. If you were to include all transfer payments and taxes, income inequality has actually fallen by 3% since 1947 as compared to increasing to the 22.9% shown by the census measure. So they actually say inequality is actually becoming better. We're reducing inequality, right? Income inequality has fallen by 3%. Remarkable result. So that's a major critique. It's still early that the full debate hasn't been resolved, so I'm sure the other side will look at this carefully and there will be counter arguments. The other critique that came about recently was two economists who are government officials, one at the Treasury Department, one in the US Congress in the Joint Committee on Taxation. They published an article in another leading economics journal. So you're not talking about back of the envelope analyses. You're talking about very prestigious, you have to be really good to be accepted to publish in these kinds of journals, okay? So they're highly, highly trusted. And what they argue is kind of like what Senator Gramm and his colleagues argue, that you haven't included everything, and furthermore, they changed some of the assumptions by Piketty and Saez, those pioneers, and they argue if you change those assumptions, then you're going to have a different result. Highly technical, but if you're still with me, I'll simply summarize some of the examples of the issues that are relevant, that are relevant to the debate, okay? And once I explain them, I think it'll be obvious why there's that debate, okay? And they're plausible. These are, no one side holds a monopoly on the right answer. It's still somewhat debatable. So for instance, one contentious issue is, how do you estimate unreported income? What we sometimes call tax evasion. People just don't report. So if you go back to the early pioneers, Piketty and Saez, what they argue is that it's the rich people who typically hide more income. They don't report a lot of their income. They evade taxes. Just look at all these tax havens offshore, right? Whereas the newer people, the critiques, argue, no, it's the poorer people. The waitresses, the waiters, the service workers, the bartenders, they don't report their tips, right? The plumber who comes to your house to fix the plumbing, you write him or her a check, or you give him or her cash. A check is traceable, right? But you give the plumber money, plumber doesn't report it, okay? So the critique is, it's the poor people who don't report all of their income, and you see, therefore, both arguments are plausible. It's an empirical question, right? Who's right? Because if the rich people don't report their income, then really inequality is worse than you think. But if the poor people are the ones who don't report their income, then inequality isn't as bad as you think, right? You see the logic there? That's the nature of the debate, okay? So unreported income, that's one issue, and it's ongoing. We don't know, by definition, if it's unreported, how would you know, right? And that's the challenge for social sciences. You just don't know. There are studies. One important recent study did conclude, when they estimated who doesn't report income, the conclusion they came up with was that it does appear that it's the people in the upper income brackets that tend to have more unreported income, okay? But again, it's not settled. Yes, Cheryl?
So there, I would imagine that there is some kind of index or lens on the cash economy.
On the what?
On the cash economy.
Yeah.
Somebody is
Right.
concerning themselves with that piece and could possibly
Sure.
blend a coefficient for it.
Sure. When cash is used in traceable transactions, all the data are there. The problem is, if you think about it, these are essentially illegal activities, and by definition, people go to great lengths. I'm not saying if that happens or who does it or whether it's the rich or the poor. I'm just saying whoever does it, if they do it, it's by definition not traceable. Because if it were traceable, you would catch them and prosecute them, right? So, and so that's the issue, that's a problem.
We
So
don't have any problem putting a dollar figure on a drug economy.
but it's comparable. We can estimate the dollar figure, but you're also like immigration. You can estimate it, but you really can't be completely sure the actual number is accurate. Yeah, that's the sort of.
But there would be an acceptable range of error, right?
Sure. And that's why I say there is a study that tries to do that, and has come up with the conclusion that it does appear that if you make certain assumptions based on tax audits done by the IRS, based on the responses to those tax audits, it's a very elaborate methodology, you can infer. I wouldn't say you can conclude definitively, but you can infer. It looks like those in the upper income brackets, their unreported income is a bigger share compared to unreported income on the part of the lower income brackets, okay? But not definitive. Yeah, we can estimate it, that's all we can do. All right.
This is not an empirical comment,
Yeah.
but when the IRS had employees that went after tax money, they didn't hire 80,000 people to go after the poor. They went after where the money is, the wealthy. And that's where they collected their money.
Right, based on the assumption that it was those people that committed those sorts of activities, sure. Yeah, but it's something you can never quite define down, to a very concrete number. So it's just one of those things. Because again, the word unreported by definition means you can't trace it. So whether it's drugs, immigration, or other sorts of illicit activities. Okay, so government spending. So what the critics argue is that if you look at government spending, especially on things like public infrastructure, right, roads, broadband, education is the big one, the benefits of those kinds of government programs go disproportionately to poorer people. And the evidence does bear that out. Especially in education, it is families in lower income brackets, their children benefit proportionately more than the children of more well-to-do families from public education expenditures, okay? So the argument, therefore, on the part of the critics is that if you ignore that government spending, that's really making the poor better than it seems, then you're going to say that things are very unequal, when in fact, they're benefiting from these government expenditures, okay? Does that make sense? So that is another area of contention. And the pioneering authors, Piketty and Saez, would argue they're irrelevant. So they include those expenditures, but they make sure that it doesn't have an impact on the distribution. Whereas the critics argue, no, you should allocate the government spending to show that they benefit the poorer families more than they benefit the rich families. That's what I mean by assumption, you see? So it isn't just the facts, it's also what you assume to be true, okay? But in fairness, as I said, the evidence does seem to suggest that yes, kids in the poorer families do tend to benefit more from public expenditures on public goods, especially education, Okay, so that's one area. Again, I'm not here to settle the question. I'm just here to point out. Oh, yes, please.
If that was pointed out, wouldn't the income of those lower
Reflected,
lower
right.
income people be rising, and it's not? So
That's right. That would be the counter argument to the critique, right? Exactly right. So if they're really benefiting so much, how come you're still seeing poor kids not reaching the levels of earnings that other, well-to-do kids are earning? So yes, absolutely. And so see, you're seeing exactly what I see. Those are the contentious elements of the debate. Okay, that's why it's not settled. Who pays for government deficits? The argument on the part of the critics is that if you look historically at overspending by the government, the vast majority of that deficit spending has been financed by richer people through higher taxes. And therefore, if you take that into account, then the rich aren't really as rich as you think. They're really paying for society by financing all these deficits, okay? Again, I'm not saying you should accept that, but that's the argument on the part of the critics. And lastly, I think this is something we all can identify with. There's really, it's very hard to measure things like non-cash benefits. Perfect example, employer-provided health care. Historically, economists treat this as income, right? We assume that it's like the employer paying you even though what you're getting is a service in kind. Medical care, it's not direct cash. So the argument is if you include these non-cash benefits, then again, poor people, to the extent that they're getting a lot of this, they're not as poor as you think, right? Once again, it's both an assumption issue, what do you assume, but also an empirical question. What's the magnitude of who gets what, how much health care benefits there are, and so on and so forth. Okay, so it's just all over the place. There's just no definitive answer. If you're interested, much of what I've explained comes from a very nice article published in The Atlantic just last year that, as you can see from the title, a baffling academic feud over income inequality. So it's like one of those rare occasions, I shouldn't say rare, it's one of those actually frequent occasions where people like me, economists, debate and disagree. Okay, I'm almost there. I'm really sorry for keeping you all so late, but I think you're all so nice and patient. What are the potential consequences? Many, right? All of you, I'm sure, being well-read, know of some of them. There are all kinds of consequences in all kinds of realms. So I'm only going to point out a few of the more obvious ones, mainly in the area of healthcare. But you can imagine the consequences, if you've read recent news, include things like poorer communities tend to be more negatively affected by the effects of global climate change, right? Poor communities, there was a documentary about villages up in Alaska, for instance. So environment consequences, I don't even talk about them here. I'm just saying there are so many other potential consequences. I'm only going to point out a few. It's just the tip of the iceberg. So what happened was in 2009, over 10 years ago, two British epidemiologists published a book which has been widely cited and fairly favorably reviewed. And I'll show you some of their statistics. What they argue, you can just judge by their title. It's still available. You can buy the book. It's still in print. They call it The Spirit Level, Why Greater Equality Makes Society Stronger. And more recently, an American physician, Dr. Stephen Baruchka, published a book which focused on the impact of inequality, especially as it pertained to the effects of the COVID-19 pandemic. And he titled his book appropriately, Inequality Kills Us All, COVID-19's Health Lessons for the World, okay? So I focus on the health aspects, I think partly because it's a more immediate impact. I think we can more relate to it at the personal level, but again, there are all kinds of other impacts that other people have pointed out as well due to inequality. So what do they say? I'll show you two slides from their book, The Spirit Level, the two British epidemiologists. You probably won't be able to read everything, so I'll just tell you what it says. If you measure income inequality by various ways, either the Gini index or by other variables like, what percent of the income is owned by the top 10%. Okay? However you measure it, it's some measure of income inequality. So as you go to the right, you have more and more inequality. The vertical axis is they compiled an index of health and social problems. And these are the components of that index. Life expectancy, literacy, infant mortality, you get the idea. crime like homicides, imprisonment, teenage birth, mental illness, obesity, social mobility. All of that's compiled into a single number. And what they do is they look at countries across the world and they correlate one to the other. Now, to go back to what I said earlier with respect to Cheryl's observation, correlation doesn't necessarily imply causation. But I think in this case, many observers would argue that you can pretty safely assume that there's, if not complete causation, a pretty strong degree of causation. And you see, it's a pretty clear relationship, right? The more unequal a society, the higher is the index which represents worse social outcomes in terms of crime, personal attributes, homicides, suicides, you name it. And as I pointed out earlier, the US is way up here. Very unequal, and compared to other countries, I think somebody else pointed out earlier, compared to other countries, not as good a performer as some of these other countries, okay? So that's one. And then the second slide is, and there are lots of other slides, so I'm not doing justice, but I think these capture the essence of what they are arguing. The second slide does the same thing. Inequality moving more and more, and then the index of these health and social problems, but they do it for the 50 US states. And what you see is the same clear relationship. Okay, these are individual states. Mississippi, Louisiana, Alabama, places where income inequality is very high, where the index of health and social problems represents a worse outcome. States down here, Utah, Iowa, New Hampshire, Vermont, Minnesota, Wisconsin, Nebraska, they tend to fare a little bit better. Less inequality, better health and social outcomes, okay? So the evidence is fairly strong. Well, I'm coming really close to the end, so I'll show you that these people, the epidemiologists from the UK, were not the first people to point out health and social negative outcomes. Back millennia, if you go back to look at people like Plato considered inequality to be, in his words, the greatest of all plagues. Okay? He felt that it would really have a detrimental impact on society at large. Much of what we discussed this evening pertain to the effect monetarily, right? The fact that more people get richer, they get more income when there's more inequality. But there's actually another big literature led by this gentleman that pinpoints more subtle negative consequences of inequality. This is Professor Joseph Stiglitz. If you've read about him, you may know of him, one of the most prominent economists. He won the Nobel Prize for his contribution in the field of information economics, and he has been one of the leaders in the research on inequality. This is one of his most well-known books, published a few years ago, on the price of inequality. And the reason I like to bring him up is because, again, he doesn't focus so much on the monetary or pecuniary aspects of inequality. He focuses instead on the more unmeasurable, the intangible, and nevertheless equally destructive potential consequences of inequality. So what are they? Things like the detrimental impact on our democratic politics, the detrimental impact on our system of justice, right? Without going into detail, I think all of us, if we sort of understand everything that's going on around us today, you kind of can understand where he's coming from. You can't measure the strength or the weakness of democracy, right? I suppose you can. Go back to Cheryl. You can always estimate it, using some measure. But it's not like a dollar figure, which is a little bit more concrete, right? In fact, some philosophers would argue that you probably don't know when democracy goes away until it goes away, right? It's that intangible, okay? And likewise, system of justice. Once the court system is weakened, how do you measure that? It's very, very nebulous, very intangible, okay? Those things, I think, are, if anything, more important to consider because they're unmeasurable and less tangible. They're often things we overlook. And yet, I think we would all agree with Professor Stiglitz that, yeah, inequality, and the reason for this is obvious, right? We've seen that even, in our recent history, where if you combine monetary power with political authority, then you have people who have money who can influence policy in the direction such that they can then earn even more money, which then empowers them to influence the political policies even more, which then give them more income to do more control. And you see the idea. It snowballs so that the inequality means that those who have the resources, the financial resources, they end up pushing policies that will benefit them and potentially to the detriment of others. And that's the fear. That's what Professor Stiglitz's main contribution is in books like this, okay? I'm really coming to the end, don't worry, but a book recently that you may or may not have seen is from a historian, Walter Scheidel. He wrote a book called The Great Leveler. And when I first saw this, I thought, that's kind of intriguing. What does it mean, the Great Leveler? Well, once you give it a minute's thought, it should be obvious what he meant. So how do you level the degree of inequality? In other words, compress income distribution. And it's a massive volume. It's a really, really thick book, very dense. Why? Because he explores inequality going all the way back to the Stone Age, believe it or not. So you're talking about millennia, okay? Millennia of analyses. And what he concluded through this comprehensive examination of world history is that anytime inequality starts to spin out of control, it gets to the point where it's so bad that society is negatively affected, there have always been only 4 things that can eliminate that inequality. That is, that can return us to a more even, compressed distribution. What are those 4 things? He compares it, to the biblical reference to the apocalypse. So the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, okay? So these are the 4 levelers. What are they? Mass mobilization warfare. That's one of the ways that we can get rid of massive inequality. Transformative revolution, kind of like China in 1949, right? Where the peasant uprising led to the communist revolution. State failure, governments simply break down. Lethal pandemics, which kind of hit close to home, right? Lethal pandemics. So Professor Scheidel argues there's really only 4 ways out of this. If inequality continues apace, these are the only 4 ways that inequality can somehow be reversed. And then the last slide is from Adam Smith. I leave you with this because I'm an economist, and Adam Smith is the most famous economist in modern history. He's often considered to be the father of modern economics. And if you were here for my talk on poverty a couple of years ago, you may have seen me cite this. But Adam Smith is best known for a book called The Wealth of Nations. In fact, many people don't realize that Adam Smith was truly what we call a philosopher, a political philosopher, and he published a second book which is less well known, but actually also quite influential. The second book is called The Theory of Moral Sentiments. And this quotation is from Adam Smith's Theory of Moral Sentiments. What Adam Smith said was that the disposition on the part of all of us to admire and almost to worship the rich and the powerful, and on the other hand, to despise or at least to neglect those persons of poor and mean condition, although these are necessary both to establish and to maintain the distinction of ranks and the order of society. Adam Smith lived in a time in the late 18th century when society was still highly structured. So he recognized that even though this kind of discrepancy and gaps in outcomes was not good, that it was necessary to preserve the social order. So he kind of accepted that. But he said that disparity, the fact that we admire and almost worship the rich and neglect or despise the people at the other end, that is the great and most universal cause of the corruption of our moral sentiments. I think that encapsulates pretty well how many people would feel about inequality, that it's that intangible element that I talked about with respect to Professor Stiglitz. You can't measure morality, and yet what Adam Smith is saying is that inequality may have an impact, a significant impact on our morality, on our moral compass. How do you measure it, right? We can estimate it again, but we can't put a number on it. And yet, to the extent that it does corrupt our morals, it is an insidious negative effect. So, I, again, am so sorry to have kept you for so long. So let me stop there. I'm going to be here. Oh, I love this stuff, so, but thank you all. Thank you all. I'm happy to I'm happy to entertain other questions if you still have the energy to do so. But yes.
I want to go all the way back to your 0.01%. No, you don't have to bring it up. Is there a way to put a people number to that? Those, in other words, 0.01 is a percentage of income earners. Is there a percentage of the population or a number of people that fit in that category?
Right. The numbers are there. I just didn't include it, but you can look it up. How many people are actually there? But since you asked it, let me give you a metaphor or an example. And then even though I can't give you a specific number, I think you'll get a sense of the answer, okay? So a lot of people have pointed this out. If you were to go back, let's say, even not that far back, 20, 25 years ago, and if you wanted to transport the wealthiest people on the planet from one location to another location, say you want to ship them from Erie to New York City or to, Charlotte, North Carolina, you would have to rent a big Greyhound bus to be able to fit all those wealthy people to transport them from one city to another. Fast forward to today, if you wanted to transport the wealthiest people on the planet from Erie to Charlotte, you could order a small twin-engine jet plane and fit the 4 or 5 of them and fly them to Charlotte. Okay, you see the metaphor? That's how much concentration of income has taken place over even the last few decades. So I'm sorry I don't have the actual number for you, but that gives you a sense of how tiny the sliver is.
Don't they say that there's 3 families that hold 50% of the wealth?
Yeah, there are so many statistics that give us the same. Yeah. If you read the work, if you go to the literature I've cited, there are a ton of statistics that will sort of reinforce what I've said, but I've already gone way beyond my time allotment, so I just had to restrict it to what I thought would be the most interesting to see. So, yes.
These economists have come out recently, for the counterpoints.
Yeah.
There's always a place for devil's advocate, and it's all fine, but it almost feels like they're saying, don't believe your lying eyes. Because it seems so clear and obvious, just anecdotally.
Right.
And I get what they're doing and why, but it just feels so counterintuitive to what we're experiencing.
Right.
And the other thing that made me think of it, I was sitting here, and not to be flippant about it, because I love all the stats, but I don't know if you ever heard what Mark Twain said.
Of course.
That there are 3 kinds of lies.
Oh.
Yeah. He said there are 3 kinds of lies. Lies, damn lies, and statistics.
Yeah, I've heard that. That's great.
I thought you liked it.
Yeah. I actually teach my students another Mark Twain quote, so thanks for reminding me of it. I tell my students, and to be honest, historians dispute whether it was really Mark Twain who said this, but he purportedly said, it ain't what you don't know that will hurt you. It's what you know that ain't true, that ain't so. It's what you know that ain't so. And I always tell that to my students on the first day of every semester, because I tell them, I'm here to educate you. The worst thing about having the wrong answer is to continue believing that that's the right answer, even though it's the wrong answer, right? It's okay to be wrong, but at least you go back and correct yourself. It will hurt you if you continue to think that it's correct, even though it's wrong, okay? So I love Mark Twain quotations too, great. But to go back to your first point, yes. I also like the other quotation, who are you going to believe, me or your lying eyes? That's a very popular. I wouldn't go that far, but I kind of am more on that side of things, because if we look at many other variables that we can observe, it's really pretty indisputable that things are more and more skewed. I'll give you another quick example. If you look at the ratio of the earnings of top CEOs, corporate leaders, compared to the average earnings of the typical, factory worker, that's always been a big number. But the ratio, the degree of bigness has just exploded over the last few decades, and on and on. So in other words, you can look at all kinds of things that point to, yes, the growth of inequality, and to deny that, I think, is kind of somewhat, it's obstructive to our understanding, sure, yeah. So thanks for pointing that out. Okay, thank you all again, and best wishes.